she was pregnant, and
her mafia husband called her obedient.
Serafina stood outside his study with a whiskey tray in her hands and a pregnancy test hidden in her coat pocket. And inside,
Dorian Blackthorne laughed with powerful men while they discussed her like property, like a womb, like a business asset. He didn't defend her. He didn't even flinch. So that night, she took off the wedding ring, walked her through the suburban sex exit, and vanished into the cold Manhattan dark. Let us examine this case file together. Serafina stands 6 paces behind Dorian in their Manhattan penthouse, observing him fraternize with she were to disgust of breeding stock. The environment reeks of imported and generational wealth. Class grids of a narcissist's constructed reality. Dorian does not defend her honor. Instead, he pours more liquid. In her pocket rests a positive pregnancy test, a catalyst that suddenly shatters her cognitive dissonance. She realizes with chilling lucidity that her captor never harbored a genuine affection. Thus, she trips our servant and the crisp October night. The clinical author is simple survival, silent betrayal. This was the architecture of systemic dominance. Wealth so entrenched it functioned as its own gravitational pull. Serafina moved through the marble corridors, balancing a silver tray with the precise motor control of a conditioned subject. She carried woody glasses of neat whiskey, catering to Dorian's obsessive need for environmental regulation. Every variable had to be perfectly managed. From the adjacent study, she could hear the auditory signatures of her captors. Dorian spoke first, his vocal cadence engineered to subjugate rivals and command immediate compliance. Thinking Marcus kept the syndicate's primary enforcer, his tone laced with abrasive hostility. In pathological dynamics, the enforcer serves as this blunt instrument, the reinforcing control through ambient intimidation. 2 operatives completed the group, radiating the distinct markers of predatory aggression and expensive cologne. One remarked that acquiring the Veil Girl was a calculated tactical maneuver, freezing Serafina in her tracks. They praised her untainted familial record, highlighting her utility as a shield against legal scrutiny. Another noted her physical symmetry as an advantageous bonus. Marcus responded with a guttural laugh, devoid of any genuine human warmth. He calculously reduced his existence to a mere incubator. Serafina maintained absolute physiological control, her grip perfectly steady on the critical equate. In the orbit of a megalomaniacal narcissist, the victim quickly learns a painful lesson. Displaying emotional reactivity only invites further psychological punishment. Dorian analyzed her behavior with the detached precision of a researcher evaluating a compliant organism. He praised her lack of resistance, her operational efficiency, and her conditions. Marcus mocked the absence of romance, prompting Dorian to dismiss emotional intimacy as an unnecessary liability. Standing in the corridor, Serafina experienced an acute dissociative episode. Her internal emotional landscape simply ceased functioning, freezing over like a glacial lake. She had always recognized the transactional nature of her union, negotiated by her late father to secure familial preservation. She was the currency exchanged for protection, yet understanding your systemic value is entirely different from the raw psychological trauma of hearing yourself reduced to an object. Stick with me here as we observe textbook rationalization, a common coping mechanism among trauma victims. She hoped that consistent compliance and empathy might eventually foster a genuine interpersonal bond. However, Auditing his clinical dissection of her utility permanently shattered this cognitive distortion. And she entered the study. The 4 subjects registered her presence, yet Dorian remained seated, an overt display of hierarchical supremacy. He ceased performing basic social courtesies the moment their contract was finalized. She distributed the beverages with methodical precision, avoiding direct eye contact to minimize threat triggers. When Dorian offered a dismissive gesture of gratitude, she deployed her conditioned smile and retreated. She maintained a steady gait through the perimeter, bypassing the sanitation quarters, where she had previously experienced an isolated emotional breakdown. That prior incident occurred when Dorian's complete lack of affective empathy made her feel entirely invisible. She passed the domestic sector, where the staff maintained a collective delusion regarding the severe emotional fragmentation of the primary bedroom. Retreating to her private enclave, she extracted the diagnostic strip. 2 lines confirmed her biological reality. She assumed a seated position and stared at the Kellerichel's reaction until the solar illumination faded into complete darkness. At midnight, she initiated a tactical withdrawal, selecting an old inconspicuous canvas bag over the luxury items that symbolized her captivity. She systematically packed standard garments devoid of socioeconomic indicators, along with a maternal heirloom and an unregistered device she acquired during a subconscious moment of self-professed moments of level. The household was dormant. Dorian remained in his command center, likely micromanaging his illicit global operations. His narcissistic focus guaranteed he would not detect her absence until the subsequent morning cycle. She deposited her matrimonial band on the wooden surface, abstaining from any theatrical displays of rebellion. There was no property damage, no documented manifesto. She simply left the golden constraint behind and exited the primary structure. True liberation requires deliberate, quiet action, not a dramatic performance for the captor who kept you locked inside a cage. Navigating the ground level, she encountered the nocturnal security personnel. Miguel expressed surprise at her unescorted departure. She deployed a calm, deflective vocal tone, citing a need for environmental exposure because so consistently had demonstrated the authentic human empathy toward his familial unit. Miguel did not initiate further containment protocols. Upon exiting, the sharp atmospheric drop provided immediate sensory grounding. She secured anonymous transit to the upper quadrant of the city, utilizing an untraceable currency, the frequent absorbent escape, frequently with the interrogation. Her destination was the sanctuary of a biological relative, a female elder who had successfully exerted elimination into the parasitic power structures of the elite. Let us analyze this interaction together. The elder relative granted her immediate entry, rapidly assessing Serafina's distressed micro-expressions. They relocated to the preparation area, an environment signifying authentic rather than performative. Marielle refrained from initiating an aggressive interrogation, demonstrating high emotional intelligence and total immunity to the syndicate's reputation. Serafina articulated her biological condition with blunt efficiency. The elder's facial musculature remained perfectly neutral as she inquired about the primary aggressor's awareness. Serafina anchored herself to the thermal output of a warm vessel. She confessed to uncertainty regarding future disclosures, prioritizing immediate psychological safety over long-term strategic planning. Her verbal processing stalled, indicative of neurological overload, before she explicitly stated her need for permanent geographical separation. When questioned about her trajectory, Serafina identified an ancestral stronghold in the northern sector. This state represented an isolated perimeter outside the syndicate's immediate sphere of influence. Dorian had previously attempted to manipulate her into liquidating this asset, diagnosing it as a logistical burden lacking strategic utility. Her refusal to comply was her sole act of psychological resistance during their union. The property suffered from severe structural degradation and lacked standard security protocols, yet she remained absolutely resolute in her plan to independently establish a functional, secure, operational base. The elder warned that the primary aggressor would initiate a retrieval operation.
Serafina maintained unbroken ocular contact,
exhibiting a profound shift from submission to defiance. Recognizing this neurological stabilization, Marielle validated her talismans and recommended a legal representative disconnected from the narcissist's corrupt infrastructure. This strategic isolation is a crucial step for surviving toxic relationship dynamics. After offering physical contact to reinforce emotional support,
Marielle is just undiscovered as a psychological resilience curse. The narcissistic subject at Dorian acknowledged his wife's absence during the morning routine.
And Soliga's a subordinate noted a disruption in his daily caffeine administration protocol. You and I must carefully observe the pathology of his reaction. When an apex manipulator loses control of a subject, their initial absence is rarely concern. Dorian processed her absence merely as a logistical anomaly, assuming she was fulfilling a civic duty to enhance his public camouflage. By midday, his inability to establish communication triggered the preliminary stages of narcissistic injury. It manifested not as anxiety, but as acute irritation. When evening arrived and the retrieval of her wedding band confirmed her unauthorized departure, his ego fractured into volatile hostility. He immediately activated his enforcer, demanding a classification of her extraction. He needed to know if this was a temporary retreat or a complete permanent severance of their marital contract. The enforcer paused, calculating operational parameters before inquiring if he should initiate digital surveillance protocols. Dorian defensively asserted her status as a matrimonial asset rather than a hostile combatant, prompting Marcus to question that exact assessment. Terminating the connection, Dorian stared at the discarded symbol of his ownership. He attempted to access his neurological archives for a genuine memory of his wife, only to realize he had always perceived her as an inanimate fixture within his environment. His cognitive load was entirely dedicated to syndicate expansion, operating on the sociopathic principle that emotional attachment compromised dominance. But she had perfect compliant, making her sudden rebellion an intolerable, paradigm-shattering psychological stimulus. Let us open this file together, you and I. We observe the classic footprint of a megalomaniac narcissist. Dorian believed his subject, Serafina, was perfectly conditioned. She existed solely to regulate his ego, vanishing when his baseline stabilized. Standing in her vacant room, he experiences acute cognitive dissonance. He realizes he never cataloged her internal world or her primary motivation for the transactional bond. He retrieves the discarded ring, a high-value token he outsourced to a jeweler, completely devoid of emotional resonance. He cannot recall her reaction to it. A textbook lack of empathy. Pocketing the hardware, he retreats. Meanwhile, the subject seeks extraction through Silas Merrick, a 63-year-old legal veteran known for managing untouchable crises. begins a neutral cafe where Merrick conducts his preliminary behavioral assessment. He listens without interruption, cataloging her trauma markers. When finished, he probes her objective, asking if she intends to legally sever the bond. Sarafina exhibits residual ambivalence, a hallmark of trauma bonding. Her immediate fixation is survival, specifically protecting her ancestral property and unborn child. Merrick confirms her territorial claim is absolute, but introduces the harsh reality of custody statutes. He warns that a legal battle with an apex predator like Dorian will be financially devastating. She cites her inherited capital as a defense mechanism, yet remains acutely aware that her husband's resources will always vastly eclipse her own. We see the subject consciously dismantling her conditioning. Sarafina understands that her captor's psychological dominance relies entirely on the compliance of his targets. She recognizes his framework of control and actively chooses defiance. Her approach is highly rational. She does not seek retaliation, only the establishment of hard boundaries and autonomy. Merrick observes this psychological stabilization and agrees to construct the legal barriers, drafting separation and asset protection protocols. He warns that if the narcissist cannot accept the loss of his supply, they must prepare for a severe escalation. The subject then retreats to Ravenshade, a vast, isolated stone sanctuary surrounded by dense timber and overgrown gardens, serving as her new physical and mental fortress. The environment reflects her internal state, a structure.
She initiates a systematic reconstruction.
Securing a localized support network, including keys and a familiar housekeeper named Rose and a Groundstra. Discreet groundskeeper by engaging in mundane tasks and managing the property's heating. She recalibrates her nervous system. Her physiological stress responses diminish, allowing her a period of baseline emotional regulation. This isolation lasts exactly 14 days before the inevitable breach occurs. On a frigid November afternoon, the antagonist's vehicle penetrates her secure perimeter.
From the safety of the library, she observes Dorian, analyzing the structure, cognitively struggling to process an environment he cannot actively dominate or control.
Note the physical deviations in his presentation. The absence of his customary tie signals a slight fracture in his highly manicured persona. Sarafina intercepts him at the threshold, denying him entry.
They maintain a strict social distance, was visibly catalog her altered appearance,
noting her unbound hair as a direct, imposed aesthetic conditioning. He initiates her questioning, feigning ignorance regarding her departure. Her response is clinical dismantling of his pathology. She articulates his psychological deficit, stating clearly that she is merely a functional object in his reality, completely devoid of human value. When he attempts to deploy a standard gaslighting maneuver to rewrite her assessment, she immediately neutralizes his tactics, decisively shutting down his manipulative narrative loop. She presents her primary evidence, quoting his own objectifying language to expose his perception of her as an optimized system. Observe his immediate cognitive freeze. His brain rapidly runs a threat assessment algorithm, calculating the damage control needed to preserve his ego structure. He attempts a weak rationalization, claiming the dialogue was for associates, completely missing the emotional core of her accusation. Sarafina demonstrates remarkable regulation, keeping her vocal effect entirely flat. She acknowledges the transactional foundation of their union, but formally terminates her consent to act as his utility. His psychological mask drops, revealing genuine disorientation. Before he can recalibrate his defenses and reassert dominance, she deploys the ultimate complication into his fractured reality. She reveals the pregnancy. The revelation causes an immediate psychological short-circuit.
She establishes strict parameters, confirming the 10-week gestation and her permanent residency at the estate.
Offers him the illusion of choice, the highly effective counter-manipulation tactic. When he breaches her spatial boundary to vision, intimidation, she stands perfectly still. He clearly claims ownership of the child. His voice betraying a raw, primitive anxiety. To a megalomaniac, offspring are merely extensions of the self. Losing access equates to ego death. When he tries to invalidate her autonomy, she decisively asserts her power. She reroutes all future dialogue through her legal proxy, Silas Merrick, severing his direct line of emotional influence and leaving the apex predator utterly powerless. You and I have seen this defense mechanism before. He promises to fix the situation, desperate reflex to re-establish dominance. She identifies the fallacy immediately. There is no malfunction to correct, only a new reality to accept. She secures the physical barrier, watching his lingering shadow process the defeat before he finally retreats. Notice the absence of a definitive episode. She sheds no tears, exhibiting deep emotional fortitude. Later, in the isolation of her sanctuary, she experiences the initial physiological movements of the fetus. This somatic event triggers a profound shift in her psychological framework. She articulates a verbal reassurance to the child and instinctual attitude of maternal protection that entirely solicits to this new autonomous trajectory away from her abuser. The external environment mirrors the escalated threat level, shifting to a hazardous terrain.
Rest is violently interrupted by hypersanction, side that is
protective. Her hand automatically guards the biological asset. The intruder is not the primary aggressor, but his proxy, Marcus Spade. The subject experiences an acute stress reaction. In the criminal behavioral profiles I analyze, individuals like Marcus function as the pathological extensions of their employer's specialist, utilized for pure intimidation and erasure. She armors herself in utilitarian clothing before confronting him. He occupies the space like lethal anomaly, his predatory demeanor clashing violent against the decaying elegance of her ancestral safe house. The operative mimics politeness to bypass her defense mechanisms. She immediately establishes a verbal boundary, denying him authorization to remain. He then deploys the narcissist's secondary tactic, feigned benevolent concern for the high-value asset, the unborn child. He systematically lists the structural vulnerabilities of her sanctuary, highlighting the inadequate security to trigger a profound paranoia response. He explicitly links her biological state to severe external risk. When she adopts a closed, defensive posture, he exhibits genuine predatory curiosity. He suddenly realizes the primary aggressor kept her entirely ignorant of his operational environment. He introduces the grim reality of organized hostility, coldly confirming that her former captor possesses highly dangerous, very real adversaries. He frames her as an unprotected variable, a prime target for extortion by rival entities.
Her retort is a fascinating display of psychological resilience. She entirely refuses
the victim role, instead holding the narcissist accountable for his dehumanizing methodologies. This triggers a micro-expression in the operative, a brief flash of professional respect for her unexpected fortitude. He probes her awareness, confirming she comprehends her former status as a commodified asset. She forcefully reclaims absolute ownership of the biological child, stripping away its value as a psychological bargaining chip. The operative acknowledges her boundary, but it issues a predictive clinical warning. The primary abuser will inevitably initiate an aggressive, highly funded reclamation cycle to regain his lost legacy and reassert absolute dominance. The operative executes a classic infiltration from Gojino. He deposits a minimalist business card, establishing a subtle psychological tether back to the abusive sea ecosystem. He bypasses her hostility toward Dorian by invoking tribal loyalty, framing the unborn child as a highly protected asset within their syndicate. He strategically retreats before she can initiate a verbal rejection, but denying her cognitive closure. Left in the hallway, she faces a critical decision point. The strictly rational action would be the immediate disposal of the artifact. However, the operative's implanted seed of paranoia takes root. She retains the contact data, a subconscious acknowledgement of her severe vulnerability. Following this encounter, the primary aggressor a calculated, punitive period of sensory deprivation, 21 days of absolute deafening silence. The subject rationalizes the abuser's silence as a definitive victory, a common self-deception in early recovery. Her environment achieves a therapeutic homeostasis. The provider says maternal mirroring, ask some sort questions regarding the deputies to anxious in relative. The sanctuary's structure is systematically fortified, and the unearthing of hidden pathways perfectly symbolizes her cognitive unblocking. Her fragmented identity begins to integrate. The severe dissociation lifts, and she transitions from a manufactured persona into a functioning human entity. But in criminal behavioral analysis, absolute equality is merely the incubation period for a severe escalation. The illusion of safety fractures. The housekeeper detects a glaring visual anomaly stationed near the estate's remote perimeter. A foreign vehicle. We are about to uncover what really happens when the subject's paranoia is entirely validated. The vehicle exhibits the classic stationary surveillance pattern I have analyzed countless times outside maximum security facilities. The subject attempts a cognitive bypass, suggesting an innocuous explanation to suppress her rising panic. The housekeeper neutralizes this, citing the estate's extreme geographical isolation. As darkness descends, the subject's hypervigilance peaks, triggering a total lockdown of the perimeter. In a moment of critical psychological compromise, she activates the tether. She dials the operative. Notice the profound conditioning at play when threatened by an unknown predator. She instinctively seeks the protections of her former captors, violent a violent syndicate. The operative processes the threat data, issuing a chilling directive to remain secured. Today, you and I are going to examine a classic case study in territorial pathology. Marcus delivered the ultimatum not as a request, but as a rigid behavioral parameter. Stay inside. When the two black SUVs arrived at the estate an hour later, it was a display of sheer power for armed operatives, establishing a hard perimeter. A young enforcer with a pronounced scarched approached the door, clinically informing Serafina that her consent was irrelevant. The target was being monitored, and that the syndicate's defense mechanisms were activating. In the criminal mind, possession dictates protection. She was no longer a person. She was a secured asset. The operative retreated without allowing room for negotiation, a standard tactic to enforce compliance. By morning, Dorian initiated contact. His voice betrayed a severe lack of sleep,
pointing elevated cortisol levels and paranoid ideation. So Serafina immediately rebelled against the surveillance, a desperate attempt to reclaim vanishing.
But Dorian S.'s response was textbook megalomaniacal narcissism. He weaponized her pregnancy, reminding her that by marrying him, she had permanently assimilated into his volatile ecosystem. To a narcissist, a spouse and an unborn child are not family, they are extensions of the self, demanding absolute control. Serafina attempted to establish a psychological boundary, demanding genuine physical distance rather than a gilded cage monitored from the shadows. Dorian's refusals was absolute. He masked pathological need for the dominance, protected, claiming he could never allow any harm to befall her. It was the closest facsimile to vulnerability a man of his clinical profile could muster. Yet, rather than soothing her, it triggered acute resentment. Where was this intense attachment 6 months prior? Back in his penthouse, she realized suffered profound emotional neglect. She was only now because she carried his legacy. The empathy was entirely conditional.
She terminated the connection, a minor rebellion against her captor. Outside her window, the armed sentry stood stark against the bleak winter landscape, a constant.
She possessed reinforcement of her imprisonment.
She bade the trade dismiss him, yet self-preservation stayed her hand.
Marcus' threats was accurate. She was now a high-value target in a dangerous psychological game. Her isolation was broken a week later by the arrival of Silas Mesmeric.
The attorney presented himself at her door, clutching a heavy leather dossier, his facial micro-expressions telegraphing severe anxiety. The defensive perimeter was about to be breached by cold,
hard data. Let's look at the evidence presented. Once the provided coffee and retreated, Silas extracted a grainy surveillance photograph from his dossier. The image captured the black sedan. Silas meticulously mapped the vehicle's origins through a labyrinth of corporate shell entities, ultimately identifying the root architects, the Castello Syndicate. The revelation triggered an immediate autonomic stress response in Serafina. These were Ike's predators, rivals whom Dorian's predecessor had aggressively purged from the Like any opportunistic pathology, the Castellos had been waiting patiently for a vulnerability to exploit a fracture in the armor. So Silas clinically outlined the threat matrix. In the brutal calculus of organized crime, her pregnancy
biological weapon to deploy against Dorian. He insisted she maintain the syndicate's security apparatus.
Serafina stared at the photograph, projecting the immense psychological weight of a violent world she had desperately tried to flee. When she proposed liquidating her own assets to hire independent contractors, Silas swiftly dismantled the idea. Her personal capital was entirely inadequate compared to Dorian's vast, deeply entrenched resources. The business was already perfectly integrated. You and I have likely observed this precise dynamic in hostage negotiations. Silas proposed a pragmatic compromise, utilized the abuser's resources while fiercely guarding her locus of control. He advised her to let the operatives secure the exterior, but absolutely forbid them from breaching the physical sanctuary of the home or reporting her daily patterns back to her husband. It was a strategy of compartmentalization. She despised the clinical logic of it, yet she capitulated, demanding a formalized written contract. They would serve as her protective detail, not his surveillance state. Silas, recognizing a successful behavioral negotiation, offered a tight, calculating smile. The ensuing negotiations over the security contract were a battle of narcissistic friction. Dorian fought every boundary, demanding complete access to the residence and total veto power over her autonomy. Serafina remained immovable, forcing him to finally concede. Yet, even with the operatives relegated to the perimeter, the psychological toll was profound. The constant rotation of armed guards, an oppressive hum of hypervigilance that frayed her nervous system. She attempted to self-soothe by nesting in the nursery, seeking comfort in domestic routine. Observing her deteriorating mental state, her housekeeper finally intervened, urging her to break the cycle of isolation. Serafina's initial denial was a classic defense mechanism, but the housekeeper's deeply familiar gaze pierced right through the cognitive dissonance. She finally confessed that her reclusion was driven by profound anxiety. Driven by a need to simulate normalcy, Serafina retreated to a nearby civilian enclave. She formed the mundane ritual subversion, pushing baked goods, literature, consuming a warm beverage while observing the public. It provided a transient dopamine rush of fragile freedom. However, this illusion shattered instantly upon returning to her vehicle. A man stood parallel to her position, his posture relaxed, his gaze fixed entirely on her. Notice the immediate physiological shift. Her heart rate accelerated as the fight or flight response flooded her bloodstream. She accelerated her pace, but the operative mirrored her rhythm, maintaining a calculated predatory distance, a textbook intimidation tactic. As she fumbled with her keys, a manifestation of degrading fine motor skills under stress, the man confidently closed the gap. He addressed her by her marital title, stripping away her anonymity. His smile was devoid of empathy, a precise mirroring of psychopathic detachment. When he delivered greetings from Vincent Costello, the psychological impact was devastating. The apex predator was no longer theoretical, as was here. The operative utilized a highly effective method of coercive persuasion. He extended a physical document, framing the interaction not as an aggressive threat, but as a diplomatic negotiation. He preyed directly upon her deepest psychological vulnerability, her acute awareness of her own captivity. He astutely pointed out that she was living under the oppressive cerebral surveillance of a megalomaniac, isolated and stripped of her agency. Castillo, he suggested, could provide an alternative paradigm. When she fiercely rejected the overture from a man who stalked her, the operative smoothly deflected the blame. He'd left the geographical coordinates on her vehicle, a lingering temptation of escape.
Is manifesting in uncontrollable physical tremors. She abandoned the psychological bond and immediately contacted her security apparatus. Instead, a deeply rooted trauma response compelled her to retrieve the document and precise temporal and spatial coordinates for a rendezvous. She discarded it onto the passenger seat.
Yet the ideological seed had already been planted. That evening, severe insomnia plagued her. Her cognitive functions spun into a repetitive loop, analyzing Costello's true motives. Was it genuinely her next strategy, or was this merely a calculated move to damage Dorian? The prospect of alerting her husband as syndicate felt like absolute psychological surrender. To confess that she had been compromised, that she was even subconsciously entertaining the enemy's proposal, would completely invalidate her hard-won boundaries. At midnight, driven by obsessive compulsion, she retrieved the crumpled document from it. She meticulously analyzed the coordinate, mentally restlessly with her Stockholm syndrome. The rational mind insisted she would never attend, yet she carefully preserved the paper. By daybreak, she utilized compartmentalization to survive the morning, distracting her fractured psyche by cataloging infantile supplies with her caretaker.
Let us open the case file on Serafina, shall we? By noon, this house was entirely silent. She stood in her kitchen, her eyes fixed on the clock. 12:15, a fascinating psychological baseline.
She knew leaving was dangerous. Her amygdala was an undoubtedly warning signal, telling her this decision could prove fatal. Yet, she engaged in classic cognitive rationalization.
She convinced herself that gathering intelligence offered an advantage, that listening was not the same as capitulating. She took her coat and keys
and walked outside. When the guard asked where she was going, she simply replied she was heading into town. The mind is exceptional at lying to itself to manufacture a sense of control. When the guard offered an escort, she refused, displaying a desperate need for autonomy. She drove north toward Beacon, actively suppressing the reality of her actions, a common defense mechanism. She arrived precise at 2 p.m. at an upscale, discreet restaurant. Waiting for her was Vincent Costello. In my clinical experience, Costello presents as a textbook megalomaniac narcissist. A man in his mid-50s with silver hair, a tailored suit, and a face that mimics human warmth perfectly until you examined his eyes. Cold, calculating, void of empathy. He offered his hand. She refused it, stating she was only there to listen. He accepted this boundary. Predators rarely mind resistance from their prey. He gestured for her to sit, immediately establishing the physical dynamic of the space. While he ordered wine, she requested water. Then, Costello deployed a classic destabilizing tactic. He observed her pregnancy, framing it not as a question, but as an undeniable fact, abruptly violating her psychological boundaries. He offered hollow congratulations regarding Dorian. When she demanded his motive, he pivoted to direct confrontation, a hallmark of the narcissistic manipulator. He claimed her husband, Sphe's territory, Manhattan, Brooklyn, parts of New Jersey that rightfully belonged to his syndicate. He was setting the stage to isolate her. The conflict was no longer just business. It was deeply personal. He clinically dissected the hypervigilance and how it distracted the man. When she accused him of wanting her help to destroy her husband, Costello offered a masterful psychological reframe.
He suggested she would be helping herself. He validated her courage in walking away, then systematically dismantled her illusion of safety. She was still dependent on her captor's resources.
He offered her total independence, a new life, in exchange for Dorian operational secrets. The predator offers the caged door, but he makes sure to hold the key. He promised her a completely fabricated identity anywhere she desired. It is a seductive proposition for traumatized mind. When she accused him of demanding betrayal, he reframed it again, urging her to prioritize her own survival. He stated coldly that Dorian did not love her, that she was merely a tool for alliances. The psychological impact of these words was profound because they aligned with her own internalized fears. Just months ago, she had heard reduce her to mere inventory. But trauma bonds are complex. The victim often begins to shift their allegiance, confusing dependency for something deeper. We see this cognitive dissonance constantly in maximum security behavioral wards. She realized that aligning with her husband's enemy was not true liberation. It was trading one pathological captor for another. So she refused him. Costello absorbed the rejection emotion, flicker of emotion reminding her that was temporary. She walked away, but the physical confront of confronting an apex predator was immediate. By the time she reached her car, her central nervous system crashed. Adrenaline flooded out, leaving her hands trembling against the steering wheel. You and I have seen this somatic response in survivors countless times. She had just sat across from a man who orchestrated mass violence, and she had done it completely unprotected. Her survival instinct was finally activating. The absolute isolation of her situation became painfully made clear. If she confessed this meeting to Dorian, his narcissistic rage would be catastrophic. If his enforcer Marcus learned of it, her physical confinement would become permanent. She stared at her phone, contemplating a call to her husband. This is the hallmark of Stockholm Syndrome, seeking comfort from the exact source of your trauma. She recognized she had no viable explanation for seeking a way to permanently escape him. So, she retreated to the familiar prison of Ravenshadowed. The gate guard permitted her entry. Inside, the housekeeper, Rose, noted her pale complexion. Serafina dismissed it as simple fatigue. Masking is a vital survival tool for the captive mind. She retreated to her bedroom, staring at the ceiling as daylight faded into night. She had successfully maintained her moral boundary by rejecting Costello. Yet the anticipated psychological relief never arrived. Instead, the sensation of entrapment deepened. The human mind recognizes when the walls are closing in, even if the conscious brain refuses to admit it. At precisely midnight, that desperation was shattered by the violent sound of breaking glass. Her sympathetic nervous system engaged instantly. She heard harsh, overlapping voices below, followed by the unmistakable crack of gunfire. She grabbed her phone, dialed emergency services, and barricaded her door with a heavy dresser driven by sheer terror. Operating entirely on raw survival instinct, she crouched low behind the bed, pressing the phone to her ear. She whispered her location to the dispatcher, detailing the armed intrusion. Then, the psychological terror escalated. The heavy bedroom door rattled. A male voice, marked by an unidentifiable accent, called her by name. He deployed a common pacification lie, claiming they only wanted to talk. She maintained complete silence, denying them any engagement. The wooden door began to splinter under their physical force. Suddenly, the auditory environment erupted. Marcus announced the presence of federal agents, triggering a chaotic exchange of gunfire. She remained curled in the dark, entirely powerless, and waited. The chaotic stimuli eventually ceased, replaced by slow, methodical footsteps in the corridor. Marcus softly identified himself, attempting to de-escalate her heightened state. He assured her the immediate threat was neutralized. Operating in a dissociative haze, she moved the heavy dresser and unlocked the door. Marcus stood there, blood staining his clothing, his weapon still drawn behind him. The guards procuring as scrutimat. Marcus checked her physical place, then instructed her to they secured the to the perimeter. Instead of retreating, she stared at the captive. He was young, perhaps 25, exhibiting profound fear. She demanded his employer, but he stayed silent. She explicitly asked if Costello had orchestrated the violent breach. Dill, the young man, provided no verbal response. Marcus intervened, physically dragging the captive down the hallway.
Promising an interrogation. By morning, the clinical reality of the violence was 3 attackers neutralized, 1 deceased, 2 guards injured.
Law enforcement processed the scene, followed immediately by the syndicate's legal team. Rose mechanically prepared coffee. clinging to a mundane routine to manage her own psychological shock. Then, as the sun breached the horizon, Dorian arrived. He descended in a helicopter on the front lawn, a grand theatrical display of dominance and control, asserting ownership over the very airspace. He bypassed the chaos and located her in the library, completely shut down and staring into the void. Pay close attention to this interaction as it reveals the core of their pathology. He stopped at the threshold, his voice raw from apparent distress, asking about her and the unborn child. He crossed the room and then knelt. For the first time, this absolute sociopath exhibited genuine fear. He offered a simple apology. Exhausted, carrying the immense weight of near-death trauma, she finally wept. Yet, crucially, he did not offer physical comfort. He merely knelt there, his hands trembling slightly, before locking into rigid fists. His inability to provide human warmth in a crisis underscores his profound emotional deficits. She forcibly terminated her emotional lysis, hastily wiping her eyes. In her brutal environment, vulnerability is a lethal liability, and she knew she could no longer afford it. Her vocal tone flattened, entirely drained of affect. She stated the blunt reality. The attackers had targeted her specifically. She confronted him, acknowledging that this pervasive violence was the exact reality he had forced upon her. He reacted physically as if she had struck him, admitting his awareness of his culpability. He quietly conceded that his awareness offered no actual solution. Then Marcus broke the tension, announcing they required an immediate briefing. Dorian assisted her to her feet, though she never asked for his help. The dining room had been transformed into a tactical command center, so strewn with surveillance footage and grim photographs. 3 high-ranking members of his organization were present, including a cold-eyed woman I would identify as a psychological operative. Marcus laid out the preliminary findings. 2 assailants were low-level enforcers for the Costello organization. The third was a mercenary from Boston. Hearing Costello's name triggered an immediate visceral reaction in her. Marcus observed this micro-expression instantly. He asked if she possessed prior knowledge as his voice dangerously calibrated. Under normal circumstances, she would have deployed a defense mechanism and lied, but trauma depletes our cognitive reserves. It teaches us a brutal life lesson. Secrets are a luxury the exhausted mind can no longer afford to keep. Let us open the file on this particular interaction and analyze the behavioral baseline together. When Serafina admitted to meeting with the rival boss, Vincent Costello, the ambient tension in the room instantly shifted for Dorian, exhibiting the classic composure of a megalomaniacal narcissist, maintained a blank facial expression. Yet, the micro-expressions in his eyes revealed a chilling, predatory rage. He asked what she had done, his voice dropping her to a whisper that carried far more psychological menace than any scream. She confessed that Costello had sent an operative to approach her in Cold Spring. Marcus reacted with predictable disbelief, utterly failing to grasp the desperation that drives a trapped subject to seek any available exit, even one offered by a known predator. Dorian immediately zeroed in on her hesitations, framing her internal conflict as an act of treason. He pointed out that she had actively considered the rival offer, stripping away her autonomy in his mind. Serafina maintained Icons 5, a significant display of resistance for a victim steeped in trauma. She admitted her conflation was born of pure limbic terror, a desperate desire for an environment devoid of armed guards and nocturnal home invasions. Dorian clinically summarized the breach, emphasizing that she parlayed with an assassin who had hunted him for 3 years. Serafina defended her actions as mere reconnaissance, insisting she made no pacts and told the man to go to hell. Marcus, observing the straw collapse of their security, rubbed his face in distress, noting the sheer severity of this psychological misstep. The intelligence officer, a young woman in her 30s with tightly pulled dark hair, interjected with a cold operational analysis. She explained the behavioral leverage Costello had just acquired. By merely attending the rendezvous, Sarah signaled a severe fracture in her bond with Dorian. Narcissistic predators excel at exploiting such fractures. The officers noted that Costello could now manipulate this vulnerability, viewing Serafina as an exploitable psychological asset. He might escalate his coercive tactics, or conversely decide her unpredictability made her a liability requiring immediate termination. The diagnosis hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Serafina processed this, questioning if the previous night was retaliation or a botched abduction, thwarted only by their rapid tactical response. The officer concluded that Serafina had elevated her own threat level. Throughout this assessment, Dorian remained static, the gaze fixed on Serafina with a sociopathic intensity, masking his internal processing. With quiet authority, he ordered everyone out of the room. Marcus considered challenging the directive, but suppressed his impulse, gesturing for the security personnel to evacuate. This left the primary subjects isolated across a table littered with evidence resembling a psychological war zone. Serafina defensively insisted she had not committed betrayal. She explained her vociferous as a necessary adaptation to his predictable volatility, challenging his possessive cognitive distortions. She accused him of reacting not like a betrayed partner, but like an arrogant owner protecting his newly acquired property. She was testing her boundaries. Serafina articulated the core of her trauma response, an urgent need to establish autonomy outside the suffocating parameters of his criminal world. She detailed her grim realization that escape was structurally impossible. Even a new identity could not sever the biological and legal nethers binding her to him, primarily the unborn child and their marital contract. She recognized his absolute refusal to relinquish control. Dorian rigidly confirmed that he would never let her go. When she interrogated his sudden obsession, noting his previous profound neglect, he remained silent before offering a vulnerable admission of error. Serafina countered with a sharp, bitter laugh, recognizing that a mere acknowledgement of his mistake was clinically insufficient to repair the deep psychological damage he had repeatedly inflicted upon her. For the first time in their recorded history, the subject displayed a physical manifestation of cognitive dissonance, running a hand through his hair while appearing completely disoriented. He verbally diagnosed as his own toxic behavior, admitting which he had dehumanized her as a mere functional component of his criminal machinery. He recognized the audacity of demanding her trust after subjecting her to such severe emotional deprivation. When Serafina challenged his reasoning, "Let's open this case file." Look at Serafina in this moment, Maud. She desperately wanted to scream that she did not need Dorian's protection, but the shattered glass and the pooling blood downstairs served as a brutal reality check. "I cannot do this anymore," she whispered, the sheer exhaustion of hypervigilance breaking her down. She refused to raise a child in constant terror. Dorian, exhibiting classic megalomaniac narcissist traits, immediately offered his gilded cage. "Come back to Manhattan," he demanded, but she refused to be invisible again, She demanded to know what would happen when the danger faded. Would she revert to the obedient, silent wife? His silence was her answer. The lesson here is profoundly simple. True safety never requires you to erase who you are. That is what I thought, she stated, leaving him alone in the dining room. For the next 48 hours, her home became a sterile crime scene. Technicians documented the physical violence, ignoring the psychological ruin. Serafina recited her statement 3 times to various authorities, including an FBI agent probing Dorian's underworld connections. Clinically, her selective honesty was pure survival. She omitted her meeting with the Castello syndicate, terrified of opening a door she could never close. Meanwhile, Rose exhibited trauma-induced compulsions, cooking untouched meals and scrubbing spotless rooms to maintain an illusion of control. You cannot simply wash away trauma, no matter how hard you scrub. It is a simple, heavy truth we all eventually have to face. Security forces doubled, creating an oppressive atmosphere. Serafina established a strict boundary, barring Dorian from the house. Yet, typical of a megalomaniac, he hovered. He rented a room nearby and appeared every morning playing the devoted protector. He did not yell. He merely at her kitchen drinking coffee. His quiet presence a calculated psychological intrusion. By the 3rd day, the tension broke her silence. "Why are you still here?" she asked, watching him obsess over security logs. He claimed he trusted no one else with her safety. She sharply reminded him that he trusted absolutely no one with anything. The lesson here is quite clear. A chronic lack of trust in others is usually just a reflection of the profound darkness we harbor inside our own minds. He claimed he trusted him, but insisted she was different. Serafina deflected, calling herself just another problem for him to solve. He set his papers down and delivered a masterclass in manipulation. He called her the person he had failed. It was a calculated display of vulnerability, perfectly designed to trigger her trauma bond. And it worked. Paralyzed, she poured her tea in silence. They sat in that quiet until Marcus called with a grim update. The captive gunman had confessed. Marcus did not detail the brutal interrogation methods used, and Serafina willfully ignored the horror. The Castello family ordered the hit. The lesson here is chilling. When we deliberately choose to look away from the cruelty done in our name, we become totally complicit in the violence. Examine the pathology of this attack with me. The objective was no murder. It was psychological warfare. They wanted Serafina alive to use our leverage against Dorian. The real horror lay in details. Marcus delivered the clinical facts. The Castello syndicate did not strike blindly. They possessed classified intelligence on the curative rotations and weak entry points. Dorian's megalomaniac facade finally cracked. A leak. Someone on his payroll had sold them out. The psychological temperature of the room plummeted. The betrayer was someone with elite access, deeply embedded in their circle. Serafina felt a visceral twist of pure dread. It brings us to a lost life. So the heavy walls we build to keep enemies out are completely useless as if the monster is already living safely inside the house. Just how close was the traitor? Marcus hesitated, calculating the psychological blow. Close enough to know Serafina's private schedule. The diagnosis was catastrophic betrayal. Someone in Dorian's inner circle had weaponized his wife against him. Dorian's voice dropped to ice, his sociopathic switch flipping into hunt mode. He ordered Marcus to find them, regardless of the brutal cost. Serafina stood by the window, isolated by the spreading paranoia. She asked if it was someone he truly trusted. It had to be. Only the elite had that access. He promised to uncover the truth, triggering 2 grueling days of forensic audits and interrogations. The lesson here is vital. Trust is a beautiful human vulnerability, but in the wrong hands, it is merely a loaded weapon pointed directly at your own head. Under acute stress, a subject like Dorian displays textbook hyperarousal, 2 full days without sleep, dissecting his syndicate with surgical paranoia until Marcus found the infection. Picture the psychological contrast.
Serafina seeking normative stability by building a crib with Rose is by Dorian, his face ashen. He simply said, "We need to talk." Rose left. When Serafina asked what happened, Dorian revealed the fracture. It was cousin Leo, the man who once stood in the penthouse discussing her like livestock with psychopathic detachment.
In forensic profiling, we call Leo's polite family dinner smiles the mask of sanity.
The lesson here is this simple.
The most dangerous predators rarely bare their teeth. They just smile across the table. Serafina inquired about his artist, though her physiological response, a heavy, sinking sensation in her chest, indicated she already knew the truth. Leo had been feeding Castello critical intelligence for months. Security protocols, financial negotiations, the very infrastructure of their syndicate. Dorian exhibited visible tremors.
He stated that Leo was family, struggling with the cognitive dissonance of betrayal. He had brought Leo into his inner circle because of blood ties,
only to be sold out for a percentage of the territory.
Cooper addiction. He required capital and lacked the empathy who suffered for it.
Serafina collapsed onto the floor, her adrenal system utterly depleted.
Let us examine the pathology of this moment together. Leo was fully aware of the pregnancy. He knew Sat was Satnachui at the estate.
Yet he provided Castello with the exact coordinates and optimal timing for an assault. Dorian's facial effect shifted to something entirely murderous. Leo had compromised the survival of their unborn child for financial gain. When Serafina inquired about Leo's current location, Dorian simply replied that Marcus had him. Serafina did not press for details, demonstrating for unconscious psychological defense mechanism. Dorian insisted she deserved the truth, concluding that in their specific socio-cultural environment, if such familial betrayal necessitated a terminal, violent outcome, the mere conceptualization of further violence used profound somatic distress within her. She begged him to spare her the details and simply terminate the cycle of trauma. Dorian knelt, closing the physical distance, and for the very first time, grasped her hand. His grip provided a stabilizing sensory input, and she resented her own psychological dependency, textbook symptom of emerging Stockholm syndrome. He promised to handle it. By morning, Leo had been permanently removed from the equation.
Neither Marcus nor Dorian offered an explanation. Dorian returned at dawn, exhibiting severe sleep deprivation, and sat in the kitchen. He announced that the task was complete. Serafina nodded.
Enveloped in dissociative numbness, she felt no shock, no horror, merely a profound affective flattening. She rationally pointed out that Castello would inevitably retaliate, perpetuating the cycle of violence. Serafina vocalized her inability to continue living this way, her voice fracturing under immense psychological strain. The prospect of raising an infant in an environment defined by intrafamilial homicide was unbearable to her. Dorian looked at her, and for a fleeting second, the megalomaniac narcissist displayed an emotion entirely alien to his baseline profile, genuine, unadulterated doubt. He openly admitted his uncertainty, yet his pathological need for control remained intact, insisting they would resolve the crisis as a unified entity. Serafina attempted to
reinforce psychological boundaries, stating there were two hostages trapped within the same cognitive nightmare.
Dorian immediately proposed a radical behavioral shift, terminating the conflict by negotiating directly with Castello. He suggested surrendering territory, financial assets,
and structural access to pacify the rival syndicate. From a clinical standpoint, this was an astonishing concession, the apex predator.
He acknowledged Castello might perceive this as weakness, or perhaps as calculated pragmatism. Castello sought an advantage to manipulate Dorian's decisions, and in Dorian's mind, offering strategic compromise would allow them to survive and rear their child free from hypervigilance. You and I must understand the sheer magnitude of this psychological pivot. A man defined by absolute control was proposing to relinquish his empire for her and the unborn child. Her cognitive dissonance was severe. Trust was a psychological luxury her trauma simply could not accommodate. She posed a logical query regarding the possibility of Castello demanding more. Dorian responded with flat, unused certainty, stating he would systematically surrender every asset until nothing remained. When she suggested he would ultimately project his resentment on her, his vocal tone remained completely steady, but he had simply relocate again. For a man who had hoarded authority, this bordered on clinical insanity. To voluntarily dismantle his own power structure was deeply contrary to his established behavioral pattern, yet his micro-expressions indicated genuine intent.
Serafina requested temporal space to process the data. Dorian agreed, pausing at the threshold of the room. He stated his intention to methodically earn her trust, not as a strategic maneuver,
but because she possessed intrinsic value. Perhaps those most profound clinical observations we can make here is a simple life lesson. The most deeply entrenched behavioral patterns can fracture when confronted with genuine human connection. Serafina remained in the kitchen, observing her reflection, grappling with whether an antisocial personality could rewrite its core programming.
They select territory for the negotiation, a standard hotel conference facility in Albany. True to his controlling pathology, Dorian demanded Serafina remain secured at the estate.
Enveloped by armed personnel, she adamantly refused, asserting her right to be present if her own physical safety was the primary currency of exchange.
Dorian argued the environment was highly volatile, but ultimately conceded to a boundary. They traveled in a heavily fortified motorcade. Seated beside Dorian,
Feriana monitored the passing winter scenery, using visual grounding techniques to manage her escalating autonomic arousal. She inquired about contingency plans, and Dorian admitted he possessed no secondary strategy as of yet. This interaction is fascinating. While you and I look closely at their behavioral dynamic, she dryly noted his lack of reassurance, using dark humor as a coping mechanism. They arrived a full 60 minutes prior to scheduled engagement. Marcus executed a meticulous tactical sweep of the environment, securing all ingress and egress points. Dorian assumed the dominant position at the head of the table, his facial affect deliberately neutralized. Vincent and Castello arrived with precise punctuality, flanked by two highly lethal enforcers. Upon observing Serafina, Castello exhibited genuine psychological surprise. He offered a polite greeting, noting her unexpected presence. He seated himself, projecting absolute physical relaxation. Dorian immediately initiated the verbal exchange. He proposed a complete cessation of hostilities, demanding the termination of all surveillance and psychological warfare, targeting his wife. In exchange, he offered the complete transfer of his highly lucrative Brooklyn waterfront operations. It was a clinical, frictionless transaction. Costello's microexpressions registered mild shock. He probed for the hidden variable that concealed this strategic trap. Dorian maintained his stoic baseline, insisting it was a simple trade of territory for stability. Costello analyzed his opponent, a sharp laugh escaping his throat. He observed aloud the profound depth of Dorian's attachment. Dorian remained entirely unresponsive to the provocation. Costello requested a 24-hour deliberation period to consult his associates. Dorian, instinctively reasserting a measure of dominance, countered with a 12-hour parameter. Costello exhibited an amused smirk, acknowledging the reflexive power per play, and agreed. He departed the room, his enforcers trailing in standard formation. The immediate silence was suffocating. Marcus verbally assessed the interaction as positive, but Dorian remained hyperfixated on the cellular device Costello had intentionally left resting on the polished table. Serafina logically deduced it was forgotten, but Dorian instantly recognized the behavioral tactics. Marcus examined the hardware and confirmed the presence of active audio surveillance technology. The psychological manipulation was brilliantly malignant. Costello had orchestrated the entire scenario merely to measure Dorian's desperation through post-meeting analysis. Dorian systematically crushed the recording devices beneath his heel, his decision-making shifting instantly from negotiation to kinetic violence. They initiated an immediate evacuation. Midway through their rear transit, a high-velocity projectile shattered the rear windshield of their vehicle. The motorcade instantly destabilized. Dorian forcibly suppressed Serafina to the floorboards, using his own biological mass as a kinetic shield. 2 pursuit vehicles engaged, deploying concentrated automatic fire that effectively neutralized their primary escort vehicle. They deviated from the primary transit route, engaging in evasive maneuvers through a dense urban grid. The pursuit vehicles maintained visual contact, continuing their aggressive ballistic assault. Shards of interior glass created a hazardous environment. Serafina exhibited an intense physiological stress response, curling defensively to shield her developing fetus from impending blunt force trauma. In that fraction of a second, analyzing Dorian's protective posture, she realized this megalomaniacal narcissist would willingly terminate his own existence to ensure hers. Rather than providing emotional comfort, this realization induced acute psychological terror. The primary hostile vehicle executed a precision tactical strike against them.
Let us process the aftermath of this critical trauma event together. When her neurological functioning slowly resumed, her spatial orientation was entirely inverted.
The vehicle had suffered a catastrophic rollover. Cranial lacerations framings compromised her vision. Beside her, Dorian presented as completely unresponsive, demonstrating symptoms of severe traumatic brain injury. She vocalized his name, escalating in volume. 0 auditory feedback. Extraneous acoustic signals indicated approaching hostiles. Unknown individuals forcibly extracted her from the wreckage, bypassing all of her autonomic physical resistance. A stranger peered down and at her, calmly delivering Costello's final psychological strike before her consciousness faded. Let us open the file on Serafina. You and I are going to examine the exact moment a victim wakes up in a predator's cage. Her skull throbbed. Her wrists were bound with industrial zip ties, grounding her on the freezing concrete of an abandoned warehouse. The sensory triggers, stale motor oil and oxidized iron would cement this trauma in her forever. Across the shadows sat Vincent Costello.
A slick megalomaniac narcissist. He watched her from a folding chair. I stated.
Her pulse skyrocketed, yet her survival instincts
Forced a mask of calm. She demanded her location. He assured her that her husband was entirely locked out. He wanted territory, power, and Dorian destroyed.
He offered a negotiation. She instantly refused to help him. Costello deployed his ultimate psychological weapon, her unborn child. The threat hit her nervous system like blunt force trauma. Her maternal reflex pulled her hands toward her abdomen, but the plastic restraints sliced into her skin. She insisted he would not cross that line. Costello's response was purely sociopathic. He would easily eliminate the infant if obstructed. He laid out the terms. She must call Dorian. He must arrive alone and surrender. She argued Dorian's ego would never permit submission. Costello merely held up a phone, eager to test that hypothesis. Serafina's mind raced, searching for an exit. There was none. She was bound, pregnant, and trapped. A stark lesson in vulnerability, the illusion of control, is always the first casualty of a criminal war. Observe her cognitive dissonance in this moment. Serafina catalogued her grim variables. Dorian, bleeding in wreckage, the security detail likely deceased, and the fetus, reliant on her nervous system. She reached a primal realization. Morality evaporates when survival is threatened. She agreed to the demand. Costello exhibited a predatory grin and unlocked the device. Adrenaline tremors compromised her motor skills as she dialed. Dorian answered instantly. She bypassed all emotion,
confirming her vitals but disclosing her capture. She relayed the strict parameters: total isolation, no tactical support. The silence on the line was heavy with behavioral calculations. Finally,
Dorian asked for the coordinates. Costello murmured the location, and she the deadly trap. Costello projected his voice into the microphone to establish dominance. Any backup would result in her immediate termination. He imposed a 60-minute countdown and severed the connection. Serafina trembled with shock, calculating whether she had just authored her husband's autopsy. Miles away, Dorian stood amidst the crushed metal of his transport. Blood tracked down his face, a marker of acute physical trauma. The line went dead. Beside him, Marcus displayed severe orthopedic damage, his arm structurally compromised. Marcus challenged the irrationality of compliance, identifying the scenario as a textbook fatal funnel. Dorian acknowledged the tactical suicide. He wiped the crimson fluid from his brow. Rationality was completely offline now. The rival boss held his wife and his genetic legacy. He had to act. Dorian finalized his decision matrix. Marcus attempted to join the mission, but Dorian enforced the isolation parameter. Marcus questioned the logic of trusting a sociopath with ethical boundaries. Dorian's gaze was flat, indicating extreme hyperfixation. Non-compliance equaled her execution. Marcus gripped Dorian's functional arm, diagnosing the plan. Terminal, walking in there, guaranteed his death. Dorian accepted this morbid prognosis with chilling detachment. His strategy was purely diversionary.
He would supply the megalomaniac with a focal point.
He would stimulate Costello's ego, maintaining a steady dialogue loop, while Marcus executed a covert extraction. Marcus processed the absolute insanity of using a mob boss as disposable bait. Dorian issued his final order. The 60-minute timer had officially begun. Stick with me, this is where the behavioral shift becomes fascinating.
The side note is massive personnel casualties as logical barriers.
Dorian's response demonstrated a total restructuring of his psychological priorities. Financial costs were irrelevant. Serafina's retrieval was his sole metric of success. The absolute authority in his voice suppressed further insubordination. Marcus initiated emergency communication protocols. Dorian propelled his battered physiology toward the operational vehicle. Intense pain signals were overridden entirely by an endocrine flood of adrenaline. He secured himself in the driver's seat, input the hostile coordinates into the navigation system, and engaged the transmission. The target was a 40-minute transit into an isolated industrial sector near the water. Dorian operated entirely outside standard criminal procedure. Zero armament, zero tactical support. His strategy relied on a low-probability miracle. His device vibrated with an anonymous psychological taunt regarding the time. He ignored the stimulus in increasing velocity. Simultaneously, Serafina was entering early hypothermia. The freezing temperatures forced her breath to condense visibly. Neuropathy set in as the ligatures severed circulation to her hands. Castello exhibited psychomotor agitation, pacing the concrete and checking his watch. Scarda Bargenet hypothesized a delay. The delay Castello's narcissism flared. He categorized Dorian's emotional attachment as a fate of the dull cognitive deficit. If the husband violated the isolation parameter, the protocol was brutally simple. Execute the female hostage, induce maximum psychological trauma, and vanish. Serafina experienced acute distress at the casual mention of her murder. She initiated measured respiratory cycles to counteract her panic response. Cognitive clarity was mandatory. Then came the fetal somatic feedback micro-movements against her ribs, confirmed their mutual viability. The predator suddenly broke the silence with a jarringly domestic inquiry regarding her gestation. She reported 5 months. He pressed for the gender. She cited a desire for a surprise. Here, we observe a terrifying psychological phenomenon. The psychopath mimicking empathy. Castello's facial musculature ranged to warm, sharp, paternal, expressional. He offered unsolicited data about his own progeny, 2 males, 1 female, the youngest recently turning 6. He crouched down, bringing his eyes level with his victim to establish a deeply uncomfortable false intimacy. Castello verbalized an abuser's rationalization, claiming no malicious intent, attributing the violence to economic necessity. Serafina proposed a logical transaction, her release, for his material gain, but the megalomaniac operates on a different axis. Castello analyzed Dorian accurately. A man built on absolute control would dedicate his life to retaliatory strikes. Castello's objective wasn't mere theft, it was total psychological annihilation. Taking the wife and the empire simultaneously would permanently fracture Dorian's psyche. He viewed murder clinically, a simple mechanism to clear the board. Serafina locked eyes with the predator, assuring him her husband would initiate violent countermeasures. Surrender was not in his pathology. Castello calmly accepted that variable. If the man fought, his death was a perfectly acceptable outcome. Let's look at this piece by piece. The narcissist declared his victory as an engine's echo breached the perimeter. Castello signaled his enforcers. The psychological theater commenced. 2 operatives seized Serafina. She suppressed a cry as acute stress assaulted her joints. They positioned her under a solitary tungsten filament, a classic interrogation motif, and forced Nyoja to kneel. The industrial barrier parted. Dorian breached the threshold. His physical vessel was degraded. Blood mask-cut his features, his movements labored. Yet his sociopathic calm remained intact till his eyes processed his wife's subjugation. At that exact moment, his emotional armor visibly fractured. He demanded her release. Castello advanced, projecting a relaxed body language to assert absolute dominance. He praised the solitary infiltration. Dorian simply reiterated his compliance. Dorian repeated his objective, but Castello initiated a delay tactic. Dialogue was required. Dorian rejected the premise, but the narcissist insisted. Castello commenced a predatory orbit around his rival, utilizing a spatial dominance. He aired decades of systemic grievance, diagnosing Dorian's lineage as a chronic obstruction. Dorian immediately offered a complete liquidation of his empire. The territories, the illicit infrastructure, all freely surrendered for Serafina's bodily autonomy. Castello finally revealed his true pathology. Economic acquisition was insufficient. Erasure was the only acceptable metric. Biological cessation or permanent exile. A breathing Dorian was a variable he could not control. Dorian absorbed the terminal diagnosis without a single micro-expression of fear. He plainly offered his own execution, provided his wife was safely evacuated. Castello flatly rejected the transaction. Dorian attempted to extract her from his systemic violence, but Castello weaponized their union, delivering a brutal psychological strike. Dorian was the sole architect of her victimization. His lifestyle contaminated her, endangering the fetus. The narcissist dismantled Dorian's martyr complex, assigning him the role of the primary aggressor. Serafina observed the microcontractions in Dorian's jaw, the physical manifestation of profound guilt. We see her trauma paradigm shift here. She recognized the clinical validity of Castello's assessment. She had voluntarily merged with an apex predator, and this trauma was the biological tax. Dorian repeated his demand, but his voice was completely shattered. He deployed a linguistic anomaly for a king begged. Castello expressed genuine amusement at the degradation. Dorian offered absolute capitulation. You and I have seen moments where weighty price breaks, but this was clinical destruction. Castello extracted a firearm and aligned the barrel with Sarafina's cranium. The ultimate manifestation of leverage. He demanded physical submission. Kneel. And Dorian's motor functions stalled. Castello reiterated the directive, attaching the threat of instant ballistic trauma. Gradually, the apex predator grounded his knees on the concrete. Serafina's cardiovascular system reached dangerous extremes. Her brain screamed for him to initiate combat, to reject this profound emasculation. But vocal paralysis seized her nervous system. Castello expressed his approval, marginally lowering the weapon. The narcissist outlined the systematic dismantling of Dorian's identity, full legal transfer of all operational assets as before witnesses, ironclad documentation, followed by total geographical erasure from the world. Castello delivered the final psychological blow. Serafina would remain in his custody as biological collateral to ensure Dorian's compliance. Dorian vocally rejected this parameter. Castello re-elevated the firearm, confirming the negotiation was permanently closed. Dorian shifted his focus to Serafina. Across the hostile architecture, they engaged in a profound nonverbal exchange. Her trauma-bonded brain decoded his micro-expressions. Profound remorse, acute sorrow, a primal directive that she endure, regardless of his mortality. Then he shattered his sociopathic baseline entirely. He verbalized a declaration of love. The phrase hit her nervous system with ballistic force. In 6 months of marriage, he had never articulated that sentiment.
Yet here, stripped of his empire and facing execution, the kingpin clung to that emotion as his final tether to humanity.
Let us open the file on Vincent Castello. Today, you and I to unpack this case together, examining the mind of a textbook megalomaniacal narcissist. When he interrupted Dorian, it was a demonstration of absolute psychological dominance. He gave his victims exactly 5 seconds to sign away their lives. Before the countdown could end, the warehouse doors shattered inward. Marcus and a tactical unit flooded the space. Rather than surrender, Castello pressed the barrel of his weapon against Serafina's temple when, in his mind, he was never trapped. His threat to execute Hoot was the calculated pivot of a Preda. The lesson here is stark. True monsters do not announce with fangs, but with the quiet expectation of absolute obedience. Castello's response to the standoff is a fascinating study in narcissistic entitlement. He calmly proposed a scenario where he walks free,
phrasing it as a benevolent alternative to mutual destruction. Dorian, however, presented a different pathology. Dropping to his knees, he offered himself as a surrogate victim,
begging the kingpin to take him instead. Castello immediately dismisses this, coldly pointing out Dorian's lack of leverage. Yet Dorian's tone shifted to something lethal, guaranteeing a violent dismemberment by the tactical team if the gun discharged. For a fleeting second, the narcissist's finger twitched. It teaches us a grim reality. When cornered by a narcissist, only a willingness to lose everything levels the playing field.
Human reflex under extreme duress defies logical self-preservation. Dorian propelled his body forward with a velocity born of primal desperation, colliding violently with his adversary.
The firearm discharged, the auditory trauma of the gunshot echoing off the walls as the projectile narrowly missed Serafina.
That effort instantly devolved into a chaotic exchange of
ballistics.
Still bound by cable ties, Serafina exhibited a pure survival instinct, throwing her ball away from the epicenter. Peering back, she observed her husband delivering a severe blunt pulpant force trauma. The takeaway is visceral. No matter how civilized we pretend to be,
true survival will always strip us down to our most primal, unapologetic, violent instincts. Castello managed to secure the discarded weapon, driven by the frantic ego of a man refusing to lose control. Dorian countered by repeatedly driving the kingpin's wrist into concrete until the firearm was dislodged. It was then that a peripheral combatant discharged a round into Dorian's shoulder. He collapsed, clutching the sudden arterial trauma. Castello retrieved the gun and targeted Dorian's cranium, but Marcus neutralized the threat, putting a ballistic round directly through Castello's sternum. The megalomaniac crumpled, shattered. As silence fell, Dorian only demanded to know his wife's location. It reminds us that even in the darkest minds, the instinct to protect what we love overrides our own physical destruction. The operative severed her restraints, and instead of fleeing the trauma zone, Serafina actively ran back into it. You and I look at this together through the lens of Stockholm Syndrome, so willingly returning to the architect of her suffering. She collapsed beside him, compressing his lacerated tissue with trembling hands. When she berated him for risking his life and he reiterated his affection, entrenchment of their trauma bond. To hear a declaration of love in an abattoir is chilling. She released a fractured vocalization of pure shock. The human lesson is deeply unsettling. Love can easily take root in toxic soil, binding us unconditionally to the very people who cause our deepest wounds.
Even while experiencing massive hypovolemic shock, Dorian-esque functioning as a syndicate leader remained active. He clinically assessed the threat level, noting the Kingpin's termination notion.
Marcus instructed them to evacuate while his operatives sanitized the crime scene. When Dorian attempted vertical mobility, his musculoskeletal structure failed him. It required the combined physical effort of his subordinate and his traumatized wife to extract him to the armored transport. Serafina cradled his head, her digits stained with his hemorrhaging blood, whispering frantic commands for him to stay conscious. It reveals a profound psychological truth. In the aftermath of severe trauma, restoration can carry the body far beyond the limits of biological failure. Neurological fade is a terrifying experience for the observer. When his eyelids fluttered open, she anchored him with a promise of future conflict, stating she possessed too much unresolved anger to let him expire. She catalogued the future, an extensive dialogue regarding their marital stability, his chronic deception, and the psychological welfare of their child. His cardiovascular system was failing, yet he squeezed her hand, offering a verbal contract to rebuild the trust he had systematically dismantled. For Serafina, promises held little weight in that blood transport. Yet they breached the hospital doors. The quiet lesson is that sometimes anger is a far more powerful anchor to life than peace. It gives the fading mind a reason to keep fighting. The emergency theater initiated an immediate intervention. The had perforated the tissue without severing major vascular structures. The blood volume deficit was severe. Out in the clinical sterility of the corridor, Serafina sat completely dissociated. This emotional numbing is a textbook physiological defense mechanism following acute trauma. Marcus provided uncontaminated garments, forcing her to wash away the biological evidence. The legal counsel materialized to manage the criminal liability. It was only when her confidant aunt, Rose, arrived and applied an embrace that her dissociative barrier ruptured. It serves as a reminder that the human mind can withstand unimaginable horror, but simple kindness is what breaks us.
Stick with me, this is where the behavioral pivot becomes truly fascinating. Approximately 12 hours post-operation, Dorian regained consciousness. The anesthesia fog slowly lifted,
revealing Serafina in a state of exhaustion, slumped against his hospital bed. Her hand remained locked onto his, a physical manifestation of her psychological tether. He observed her dormant form, intellectually recognizing his lack of merit regarding her loyalty, yet possessing a parasitic determination to retain her attachment. So Marcus then crossed the threshold, his posture reflecting severe adrenal fatigue.
The lesson is clear: guilt is a heavy, suffocating anchor.
But it is often the exact weight needed to keep a deeply damaged soul from drifting into the abyss. Marcus delivered the situational report with detachment required of a violent enforcer. The megalomaniacal narcissist was currently residing in a morgue drawer. Marcus noted that Dorian X's capacity for lethal violence had elevated his status. The criminal ecosystem would now view him with profound terror, but Dorian's response marked a sudden, radical shift in his behavioral pattern. He articulated a total rejection of the power structure, desiring complete extraction from the illicit economy. In this underworld, one does not simply submit a resignation, yet Dorian cited the catastrophic collateral damage inflicted on his family. This teaches us that true transformation rarely comes from moral clarity. It is usually born from the sheer exhaustion of loss. The proposition of adopting a civilian identity is almost an alien concept to a man neurologically wired for organized violence. Marcus warned Dorian that the criminal hierarchy views pacification as a terminal vulnerability. Predators would undoubtedly test the perimeter. Dorian exhibited a remarkable flat affect in response, stating his absolute apathy toward their perception. His singular focus had narrowed entirely to the preservation of Serafina and the fetal development. The violent ideation was gone, replaced by a fierce protective protocol. Marcus offered a physical gesture of solidarity sanctioning the pivot. It is a stark reminder that true strength is not found in inflicting violence, but in the terrifying vulnerability of choosing to walk away. She bolted upright, her sympathetic nervous system instantly analyzing his vital signs. He admitted his physical agony, yet her primary focus was the auditory data she had absorbed while feigning sleep. She scrutinized his ocular movements, searching for micro-deceptions as she inquired about his declaration of withdrawal from the syndicate. He confirmed his intent without hesitation, offering geographical relocation to any neutral territory where their past held no jurisdiction. But trauma recovery is rarely linear. She openly questioned her capacity to grant the absolution for the violent paradigms he had forced upon her psyche. The human truth here is profound. Surviving the physical trauma is only the first battle. Forgiving the architect is a lifelong war. He did not burn a door, which is a rare concession for a man accustomed to absolute authority. Instead, a probationary period demonstrated behavioral modification. To construct the paternal and marital figures she required, her optic ducts flooded as she articulated her core psychological terror. It was not a fear of physical violence, but the insidious erasure of her own identity, the classic deterioration of the self within a trauma bond. He countered with a vow to become the guardian of her autonomy. She established a rigid boundary. Any future emotional invalidation would result in her permanent departure. The lesson is vital. Firm boundaries do not destroy relationships. They are the foundation required to build healthy ones from ruins. She pulled away with an expression bordering on dark amusement, labeling their dynamic as fundamentally damaged. He offered no clinical dispute. Acknowledging the pathology is often the first step toward managing it. Outside, the thermal glass, frozen precipitation blanketed the urban landscape. Sitting in the quiet room, Serafina experienced a novel cognitive net, the actual of their sitwa. Ja, but this case, I need those of many shattered lives. Healing is never a final destination. It is a daily consciousness negotiation. 72 hours later, they secured medical clearance and returned to Raven Shade. The environment remained identical, yet the psychological resonance had shifted toward genuine security. Open the case file with me. Observe the immediate aftermath of extreme trauma. The housekeeper operated on pure instinct, preparing a sterile environment for Dorian fresh sheets. A crackling fire. She asked no questions, vanishing to allow the psychological dust to settle. That night, Serafina sat alone, staring into the flames. Her brain was desperately attempting to process a cascading series of violent events. The abduction, the warehouse bloodbath, Dorian taking a bullet, the reality of Castello's death. It induced a destitute's awakening nightmare. Yet, when she checked on Dorian, she found the apex predator propped up, reading a pregnancy manual with genuine bewilderment. "You're reading that?" she asked. His sheepish look anchored her back to reality. "I have no knowledge of infants. I hypothesized I should commence my education," he replied. Serafina crossed the room, lowering herself to the edge of the mattress. "And your preliminary findings?" she asked. "That I am entirely unequipped and will likely ruin this," he admitted. "Welcome to the demographic," she countered. This exchange is fascinating too. Traumatized subjects attempting to normalize their shattered circumstances. He discarded the literature. "We are actually attempting this domestic paradigm, aren't we?" he asked. Neither possessed the cognitive framework for domesticity, yet Dorian initiated physical contact, lacing his fingers through hers, a profound breach of his usual guarded perimeter. "I love you," he told her. Perhaps the pathology was always present. "I will reiterate it until your cognitive dissonance resolves," he insisted. Sarafina St. George gaze drifted to the nightstand, noting the absence of her discarded wedding band.
"I desire to believe your assertion," she admitted, her voice fractured. "But I require a temporal buffer. I need empirical evidence that this affection is genuine, not merely a manipulative tactic."
A completely rational defense mechanism. He applied gentle pressure to her hand, offering unconditional patience. As she moved to exit, he hesitated. "Thank you for initiating the rescue," she said. "For jeopardizing your empire." His response was clinically reviling. "You are my spouse," he stated, pausing as if recalculating his own baseline. "I should have prioritized that protocol from the onset. You and I must observe a critical behavioral shift here. For the first time in months, she did not engage the lock on her door. The physical barrier was gone. As winter deepened, plunging them into an atmospheric pressure cooker of short days and freezing nights, Dorian's physical rehabilitation was sluggish but functional. Concurrently, the systematic dismantling of his criminal infrastructure. He spent hours severing lucrative ties and transferring illicit assets. Detaching from a lifelong behavioral loop is excruciatingly difficult. Yet whenever his gaze tracked Sarafina, reading quietly, wandering the frosted gardens, her hand protectively shielding her growing abdomen, his neurological reward centers validated the sacrifice. A new biological imperative took over. His former associate, Marcus, maintained a weekly visitation schedule, delivering operational documents. "The syndicate is communicating," Marcus noted during one evaluation. "The consensus is that your psychological state has degraded. You are perceived as soft." Dorian remained impassive, instructing Marcus to terminate any insubordination. When Marcus suggested a return to active command to preempt rebellion, Dorian was unequivocal. "That operational phase is permanently terminated," he stated. Moss micro expressions indicated profound skepticism. Meanwhile, Serafina's gestation progressed toward an April 15th projection. They attended medical evaluations as a unit, observing fetal sonograms, engaging in normative disputes over nomenclature, a fragile simulation of normal. Let's look at this case file together and notice the fragile dynamic they've built. One evening in late February, within the controlled environment of the library, Serafina disrupted the baseline. "I hypothesize we should renew our marital vows," she stated. Dorian immediately ceased processing his legal documents. She articulated her rationale with striking clarity. The initial ceremony had been a strict transzerture. If we are genuinely only attempting to construct a sustainable paradigm, I require to possess intrinsic value, she explained. "I wish to select you voluntarily, free from external coercion. This marks a textbook evolution from trauma bonding into conscious attachment." Dorian processed the new data. "When?" he asked. She proposed the timeline post-delivery. His facial response was entirely authentic, a rare display of uncalculated warmth. "I would find that acceptable," he replied. Serafina mirrored the expression. For the first time since abandoning his stronghold, her cognitive models predicted a potentially viable future. However, in the taxonomy of the criminal underworld, equilibrium is a statistical anomaly. On a frigid March night, 14 days preterm, acoustic trauma shattered the silence, glass fracturing. Serafina's sympathetic nervous system spiked instantly. She dialed emergency services before contacting Dorian. "Intruder," she reported. Maintain your secure location, he commanded. She tracked his acoustic signature into the corridor, then the percussive report of a firearm. Breaching protocol, she found him bleeding. Looming above the fallen kingpin was a phantom. Leo, the biological cousin, classified in all intelligence files as deceased. Surprise, the intruder announced, his facial muscles contorting into an erratic, asymmetrical smile. Observe her physiological response here. Complete motor paralysis.
Sarafina S. visual cortex struggled to integrate the conflicting data. The dead man staying in a hallway, ballistic weapon, his footwear contaminated with her husband's blood.
You are deceased, she managed to vocalize. Leo's subsequent laughter was highly symptomatic of profound psychological fragmentation.
That was the designated narrative, he mocked. Marcus executed the deception with remarkable efficiency.
Dorian remained pinned to the hardwood, compressing his wound.
Dorian's physiological markers were critical: acute pallor, compromised respiratory function. Yet, his ocular focus remained fixed on his cousin, projecting a hostility concentrated. It could be clinically measured. You orchestrated this entire matrix. Orin. Dorian accused through clenched teeth. Leo crouched, bringing his sociopathic affect into intimate proximity. He confessed to feeding strategic intelligence to their rivals, mapping the exact coordinates for the previous ambush. But the psychological coup de grace was his revelation regarding Marcus.
I compensated him to stage my termination, Leo gloated. Loyalty is merely a linguistic construct, cousin.
Every human organism has a verifiable market value. Sarafina's neural pathways fired in chaotic succession. Marcus was a traitor.
The magnitude of this betrayal. Torian medical extraction and served as his primary enforcer, had been covertly aligned with the opposition.
What is his current location? Dorian rasped, his vocal cords struggling against massive blood loss. Leo dismissed the query, outlining a standard ghost protocol. Offshore assets, an erased identity, absolute geographical displacement. His performance was exemplary, Leo noted, casually elevating the muzzle toward Dorian's cranium. Now I execute my final protocol. Sarafina breached the perimeter, inserting herself into the active kill zone. Desist, she commanded. Pupils tracked her movement. He articulated his twisted survival logic. Dorian's continued existence meant his own death. You and I have studied profound psychological adaptation, but this is singular. She offered herself as a substitute target. Her vocal delivery was devoid of panic. I am the vessel for his genetic legacy, she stated. I represent a vital strategic asset. Terminate him, and your asset value plummets. Preserve me, and you possess a powerful bargaining chip. Leo analyzed this anomaly. You are actively negotiating for his survival, despite his historical abuse. To understand her affirmative, we must examine the Kingpin Vittorio effect, much like Luca's pain in the foundational texts of Stockholm Syndrome. Her trauma bond had mutated into genuine devotion. She no longer perceived a megalomaniac narcissist who forced a transactional union. She saw a protector who took a bullet for her. Naturally, she externalized none of this internal psychiatric analysis. She simply anchored her position. He is the paternal figure of this infant, and I will not permit his execution in my presence.
Leo subjected her to prolonged visual assessment, acknowledging
her stress tolerance. However, he introduced a catastrophic variable into her equation. Hostages were obsolete.
With stress dissolving.
Leo's endgame was total extraction, not
today.
This is not a strategic negotiation, he clarified, his tone dropping to a sociopathic deadpan. This is the systematic deletion of loose ends. He engaged the weapon's self-firing mechanism.
Bypassing all conscious thought, Serafina amygdala seized control. She weaponized a heavy brass fixture. The cranial impact registered with a dense structural fracture. Leo's equilibrium failed, triggering an involuntary muscle spasm that discharged around into the plaster above. Displaying immense aggressive momentum, Serafina delivered a secondary strike to his clavicle, collapsing his center of gravity. The firearm separated his grip as she lunged for the asset. Leo secured her lower extremity, violently reversing her trajectory.
She impacted the hardwood abdomen first. A catastrophic, lacerating pain violently disrupted her nervous system.
Operating purely on the mammalian survival drive, she delivered a heel strike to his facial architecture, rupturing his nasal cavity. Securing the weapon, she inverted her posture, depressed the rigger, and embedded a projectile into his sternum. I underestimated your capacity for lethal violence, Leo noted, a bizarrely clinical final observations 5 years before his biological systems shut down. Serafina remained supine, her rash rate critically shallow. The abdominal trauma was confirmed massive hemorrhage. Garments. Dorian, she managed, her auditory output fracturing. He was already dragging his ruined body toward her, manually compressing his chest wound. Demonstrating extreme compartmentalization, he operated his cellular device. We required dual emergency transports. Acute obstetrical distress and gunshot trauma. We are both exsanguinating. The lesson here is simple. Survival isn't just about outlasting the threat, but deciding who you bleed for in the aftermath. The patient, Dorian, exhibits the classic control response of a megalomaniac narcissist. The moment his environment fractures with Serafina going into premature labor, he attempts to reassert dominance by commanding resources. He tells her she will be okay. He doesn't know this. He simply cannot tolerate a reality he does not dictate. We see Serafina experiencing severe physical trauma, yet she anchors herself to him. This is the foundation of Stockholm Syndrome. Her captor becomes her sole source of safety. You and I must understand this mechanism. The simple truth here is that crisis reveals our deepest dependencies, forcing the brain to cling to whatever is closest, even the very source of the danger itself. Observe the medical intervention. 6 minutes elapse, an eternity in trauma processing. The paramedics isolate Serafina, immediate triggering Dorian's narcissistic injury. He has sustained a gunshot wound, yet he refuses treatment unless he physical proximity. The paramedic issues an ultimatum. Dorian concedes, not out of compliance, but to retain visibility of his psychological anchor. During transport lost, the sirens whistled. Serafina remains tethered to his hand. The clinical reality of her failing vitals strips him of his assumed omnipotence. It is a profound lesson in human fragility. Absolute control is merely an illusion we maintain until biology or physics decides otherwise. Let us examine the hospital admission phase. Dorian commands Serafina to stay with him, treating her consciousness as a metric he can regulate. She is in agonizing pain, yet she nearly laughs. That laugh is a textbook trauma response, a momentary fracture in her cognitive dissonance. In the surgical ward, medical personnel forcefully sever their connection to perform an emergencies operation. They bar him from action. They deem from entry. The megalomaniac cannot process this boundary. His own catastrophic blood loss is irrelevant to him. His inability to breach those doors is a violent disruption to his constructed reality. We learn a vital truth here. The deepest pain comes not from physical injury, but from what we own. Physical reality finally overrides his pathology. Hypovolemic shock sets in, blurring his vision, forcing compliance. He issues a final command for immediate updates, an attempt to retain a microfraction of power. In the trauma bay, as his wound is treated, he exhibits clinical dissociation. He does not despair the physical pain. Instead, his neural pathways out his loop obsessively.
Regains consciousness in the isolation of recovery.
She registers a profound somatic shift and emptiness in her abdomen. This teaches us something fundamental about the human mind. Trauma does not always scream. Sometimes it simply goes completely silent.
You and I are going to unpack this next interaction carefully. Sarafina realizes her child has been surgically removed, triggering acute maternal panic. The nurse provides clinical data. Male infant weighing merely 4 pounds, sequestered in intensive care. Note Sarafina's absolute disregard for her own critical condition. When informed she must rest due to massive hemorrhage,
she verbally rejects the surgical trauma.
Of course, narrows entirely onto locating her offspring. The medical staff attempts to enforce strict hospital protocol to keep her calm.
The lesson here clear: when the heart is absolutely terrified for something it loves, the brain will gladly ignore the bleeding of its own body. The patient is actively unraveling. Her inner state is entirely dysregulated. When the neonatal incubator is introduced, we observe a critical moment of bonding under extreme duress. The infant is severely underdeveloped, sustained entirely by artificial life support. She is denied the ability to hold him, permitted only minimal tactile contact. As she inserts her trembling hand into the enclosure, the premature infant exhibits the palmar grasp reflex. Her psychological fragmentation pauses. The connection acts as an immediate grounding mechanism. It is a beautiful but dangerous truth. Sometimes the smallest, frailest connections are the only things keeping the human mind from shattering entirely. She verbally dictates survival to the neonate, while his instinctual grip remains locked. 4 hours later, Dorian S. consciousness returns. True to the behavioral profile of a megalomaniac narcissist, his immediate response to regaining awareness is aggressive non-compliance. He violently removes his intravenous line and attempts to mobilize. His demands are absolute. Locate his wife, locate his child. When medical staff confirm their critical but stable status, the neurological flood of relief causes orthostatic instability. Advised he is not cleared for transit, he violently rejects the boundary. We see a universal law at play here. A person tuned who feels powerless will often choose physical agony over sitting still in their own fear. The nurse evaluates the threat level and accurately calculates that resistance is futile against his specific pathology. She procures the wheelchair.
Dorian willingly endures excruciating physical agony as he is transported, a testament to his obsessive drive to reclaim his territory.
The reunion with Sarafina is a fascinating study in trauma bonding. They exchange affirmations of survival. Sarafina is physically depleted, fixated on the alarming frailty of their son. Dorian immediately reinforces her resilience, categorizing the infant as a combatant, much like her. This is the reality of human connection. Shared suffering does not always break us. Sometimes it acts as the glue that holds our fractured pieces together.
Come me as we look closer at this dynamic. When she says certainty, she admits she lacks a methodology, relying purely on his character grandiosity.
They remain anchored together in the sterile environment, attempting to construct a shared reality out of chaos. Despite medical protocols, they compel the staff to transport them to the neonatal unit. There they've observed microscopic offspring battling for viability. This observation triggers a severe cognitive shift in Dorian. We must understand a core truth. Even a relationship born out of pure transaction can into our most profound and terrifying vulnerability. The architect of fear is finally terrified of losing. The naming of the infant is a highly calculated gesture. During his periods of insomnia, Dorian has been dismantling his criminal infrastructure, seeking a new behavioral baseline. He selects the name Vale, explicitly honoring Zarafina's lineage over his own. This is a masterstroke of psychological tethering. He validates her historical trauma, acknowledging that her family provided her the resilience to endure his absolute control. As she weeps in acceptance, we observe the deepest manifestation of Stockholm Syndrome. The life lesson is stark. True peace often requires us to finally surrender our own massive ego and honor the strength of the exact people we once tried so desperately to control. The infant remains hospitalized for 21 days, a sustained period of chronic physiological and emotional tension. We see a strict behavioral routine emerge. Dorian reads financial documentation aloud, an absurd transfer of his previous corporate dominance into the caregiving environment. Serafina utilizes generational coping mechanisms, singing ancestral melodies to regulate the infant's respiratory patterns. Inside the isolation ward, they are operating as a normalized parental unit. Outside, his illicit empire is completely unraveling under police scrutiny. It proves a simple reality. When everything around you is collapsing into ash, the human mind will always find one tiny, fragile thing to protect. You and I must recognize the complete inversion of his values during this period. Associates are dead, enemies have vanished, and his sprawling enterprise is systematically disintegrating under legal scrutiny. The classic megalomaniac narcissist would typically engage in ruthless damage control. Instead, Dorian exhibits absolute apathy toward the collapse of his power. His entire cognitive bandwidth is localized to a single hospital room. On the 22nd day, medical authorities determine the infant has achieved physiological independence. This reveals a powerful truth about human nature. The vast empires we spend our entire lives building mean absolutely nothing when a single life is on the line. The particular environment has been meticulously sanitized, effectively erasing the physical evidence of lethal violence. The nursery stands as a perfectly curated simulation of normative family life. As Serafina rocks into the infant, she registers a novel psychological state. It is not pure joy, but rather a tentative expectation of future safety. We can define this as the stabilization phase of her trauma adaptation. From the doorway, Dorian observes his captured ecosystem. He assesses the power, the violence, the relentless pursuit of supremacy that defined his pathology, and completely subieves Dishrasmoni's Budgeslit. The lesson we extract from this case is chillingly simple. Sometimes the darkest obsessions simply pivot to a quieter target. She invites him into the space, and he assumes a submissive physical posture on the floor. She expresses gratitude for his choice to prioritize their survival over his dominance. I want you to truly proselyte her statement. She is thanking the man who engineered her captivity for finally and choosing not to destroy her. This is the ultimate finalized trauma bond. He expresses a rare moment of regret when he observes the infant, noting the blended genetic traits. His narcissistic extension is complete. He feels an absolute sense of belonging. The fundamental lesson here is haunting. We often mistake the absence of violence for the presence of true love, and we gladly call our cages a home. Today, you and I will unpack this case file.
The postpartum months triggered severe destabilization. The infant Vale suffered acute colic,
Shrieking in 2-hour intervals. Serafina operated on a physiological stress loop of pure exhaustion. Dorian, a documented megalomaniac narcissist,
found an unpredictable infant more threatening to his ego than managing an illicit syndicate, yet their shared trauma bonded them. Rose served as the stabilizing psychological anchor,
managing environmental triggers. Assets, stomatical, dismantling his criminal his remaining holdings, proving that sometimes stripping away our perceived power is the only way to discover who we truly are. Clinically speaking, the narcissist rarely relinquishes resources without a motive. Dorian retained wealth to ensure his offspring's dominance, but discarded the excess. This normative lifestyle offered a paradoxical psychological release. When the infant achieved regulated sleep at 4 months, Serafina observed her captor-turned-partner on the terrace. Fixated on the dusk, she offered him wine, an act of conditioned subservience masquerading as affection. She asked about his mental tentote. He articulated profound cognitive dissonance. 12 months prior, he reigned from a fortress, blinded by absolute power. Now, his reality consisted of infant hygiene and nutritional anxiety. It is a stark reminder that true evolution often hides in the mundane routines. She probed his psyche, asking if he grieved his former dominance. He engaged in rare, genuine introspection. He denied missing the life, but admitted longing for its structural certainty, the rigid behavioral parameters of his pathology. He confessed to a profound internal void, acknowledging his previous existence was fundamentally hollow.
Now, he claimed, the unpredictable exhaustion of family life
possessed tangible reality. He told her it mattered.
Serafina rested her head against his shoulder, her Stockholm syndrome solidifying into permanent emotional dependency. They traded reassurances as the sky bruised into sunset colors.
Inside the perimeter, their offspring slept securely. It forces us to realize that the deepest connections are often forged in the fires meant to destroy us. Stick with me, this is where the behavioral shift becomes permanent. Their marriage was no longer a contract governed by threat and survival. They actively selected one another, internalized their traumatic bond until it felt indistinguishable from organic love. Separation, they orchestrated a vow renewal on their estate grounds, curating a controlled guest list. Only essential figures attended: the attorney, the enforcer, the housekeeper. The infant remained passives of sleeping through the ritual. The ceremony lacked the grandiosity typical of his narcissistic profile. The officiant delivered sparse directives. There were no theatrical declarations, just two deeply fractured individuals constructing a functional reality. His vocal delivery was flawlessly regulated. He pledged to perceive her not as a utilitarian object, but as an autonomous entity. He credited her initial flight response as the catalyst for his psychological survival,
validating her as his child's maternal figure. Serafina exhibited a physiological emotional response, tears mingling with a smile of total capitulation. She countered with her
the psychological space to reform,
building a genuine dynamic despite her conditioned fear.
They traded unadorned gold bands, a stark contrast to their previous opulence. When prompted, he engaged in physical affection with an intensity simulating a desperate attachment. It teaches us that vulnerability, even when manufactured from trauma, can become a defining truth. The peer group provided auditory reinforcement. The infant woke in distress and was transferred to Serafina for maternal regulation. Dorian assumed a possessive stance, wrapping an arm around her midsection while surveying his reconstructed social circle. He expressed thanking Richie for validate their thanking his enablers or outraged psychological regression. Silas toasted to second chances, a phrase repeated by the collective echo chamber. They consumed sugar, drank alcohol, and engaged in communal memory suppression, successfully blocking out the severe emotional violence of their shared history. Later, once the environment was purged of witnesses and the infant was sedated by sleep, the two subjects relocated to the isolated study. You and I must examine this next interaction. The thermal environment was controlled, the hearth fire deteriorating. Serafina produced a sealed document, drafted during her escape phase, but intentionally withheld, and Dorian asked if he should process the text. She refused, intending to incinerate the evidence. Her rationale was a symptom of trauma bonding. She explicitly rejected her healthy anger. She no longer identified with the victim who fled. Approaching the flames, she exposed the paper to the heat. It carbonized rapidly, erasing her past desperation. Her captor observed this symbolic destruction of her independence. When she pivoted, he closed the physical distance, mirroring her statement by claiming his own identity had fundamentally shifted.
He exhibited
Calculated vulnerability,
uncertainty, his moral improvement will emphasize his effort. She validated his narrative, perpetual modification.
Pressing his mouth to her cranium, he pulled her into a restrictive embrace. They remained static, entirely codependent, as atmospheric pressure shifted and seasonal decay began. 5 years later, of observation reveals their offspring navigating the estate with unconditioned vitality. Serafina retroactively classified that specific autumn evening as the primary psychological pivot of their existence, completely discounting the legal ceremonies and the biological trauma of childbirth. Life teaches us that our most defining moments are rarely the ones we celebrate in public. Her cognitive reframing centered on incinerating her grievance document, marking the erosion of her autonomy. She mutated into an entity complementing her abuser. The megalomaniac adapted his methodology, his grandiosity manifesting in hypervigilant parenting. He directed juvenile athletics, mastered culinary functions, and replaced syndicate negotiations with nighttime narratives. The underlying pathology remained. He exhibited residual authoritative impulses and chronic anxiety regarding control. Yet, she rationalized this as progress. 36 months later, they produced a female, Marielle. Subsequently, an unplanned male infant arrived, labeled Silas, naming him after the council, who facilitated her escape. Is a subconscious memorial to the freedom she surrendered. The compound became saturated with biological expansion. Rose dissolved her professional boundaries, adopting a surrogate matriarchal role. The vegetation was rehabilitated, mirroring their internal reconstruction. In this closed environment, Serafina cemented her ultimate persona. She transcended the parameters of a marital asset, identifying purely as a survivor of their psychological warfare. Naturally, they experienced interpersonal friction. Two deeply disordered individuals will inevitably clash. Yet, they developed functional coping mechanisms for conflict resolution. Their crafted reality was irregular, but entirely self-contained. During another seasonal transition, with the offspring dormant, She stood at the glass, observing the environmental decay. Let us examine this final behavioral loop. He approached her blind spot, securing her midsection to establish dominance, and demanded access to her internal monologue. She expressed relief at their survival. Rotating within his grip, she questioned the outcome had she never executed her flight response. His assessment was brutally accurate, mutual annihilation. He knew he would have consumed her identity while remaining emotionally desolate. Emotionally mutual of the mutual savior, and he permitted this narrative. She labeled her departure as her optimal choice.
He corrected her, reasserting control by stating her return was her superior action.
She rewarded his manipulation with physical intimacy, Seed misinterpreting shared exhaustion for profound peace.
The external environment continued setting whistle walls. The temperature remained regulated. Upstairs, the descendants remained unconscious.
Oblivious to the original moves of their genetic donors, they were encased in an illusion of absolute security.
Nurtured by a family unit that had shattered itself before fused the jiggered pieces back together there. You and I both know that true recovery is rarely a clean, unblemished narrative.
The dynamic was devoid of conventional romance or ethical purity.
It was a complex web of Stockholm syndromes, calculate, restraint, and mutual dependency. Yet for these specific subjects,
walking the dark corridors of their own minds, this twisted inequilibrium was superior to any fiction. One of the most meaningful lessons from Sira's Malfinas story is the importance of self-respect. At the beginning, Sira was treated less like a wife and more like a symbol of legitimacy, obedience, and family convenience. The men around Dorian discuss her as if she were property, judging her beauty, fertility, and usefulness. Even worse, Dorian does not defend her. He allowed the conversation to continue because at that point, he sees the marriage as a business arrangement rather than a human relationship. Serafina's decision to leave quietly is powerful because she does not need to scream, beg, or perform pain for others to recognize her dignity. She simply understands that she cannot remain in a place where her humanity is being erased. This teaches an important educational lesson. Self-respect often begins with recognizing when a situation is harmful, even if it looks wealthy, comfortable, or socially respectable from the outside. Many people stay in painful relationships, workplaces, or family systems because they are told they should be grateful. Serafina shows that material comfort cannot replace emotional dignity. A beautiful penthouse, expensive clothes, and a powerful last name mean nothing if a person is unseen and unloved. Her leaving is not selfish. It is an act of survival. The story encourages viewers to ask themselves whether they are being valued as people or only used for what they provide. Education should teach that every individual deserves respect, voice, and emotional safety. When someone is reduced to a role, a function, or a tool, walking away can become the first step toward reclaiming identity. Serafina's courage reminds us that dignity is not given by wealth or marriage. It is protected by the choices we make for ourselves.